Hello everybody, and welcome to the Thursday edition of Video Clips. And I'm going to cover today a new and very extensive article written by researchers Walter Willett and David Ludwig, which concludes that there is no compelling reason for people to consume cow's milk products. They can be eliminated from the diet without any negative consequences. And in fact, there are risks associated with consuming dairy that people should be knowledgeable about and should be carefully considered. The reason I decided to cover this is while I have been putting out information about the negative impact of consuming dairy products for a very, very long time, this is a pretty exhaustive review, and it comes from a couple of researchers who do not promote vegan diets and often write articles about the fact that fish can be beneficial. So they're really not coming at this from any kind of ideological standpoint. They're just reviewing the evidence and reporting what it says. All right, so some of the major concerns about dairy are that in order to increase milk production, cows are bred in ways that increase plasma levels of IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor, when consumed by humans. Cow's milk is also high in branched-chain amino acids, which further increases plasma IGF-1 levels. IGF-1 promotes cell replication and inhibits apoptosis, or cell death. It encourages increased human growth and increases the risk of many cancers, hip fractures, and pulmonary emboli. Notice hip fractures is in the list, and that's one of the things that dairy consumption is supposed to prevent. Cows are pregnant during most of the time that they're milked, which leads to higher levels of progestins, estrogens, and other hormones in the end product milk. Hormones and hormone metabolites combined with higher plasma levels of IGF-1 levels are likely responsible for the association between dairy and an increased risk of cancer, particularly breast and endometrial cancers, especially in postmenopausal women who are not taking hormone therapy. Dairy is also associated with particularly aggressive and fatal forms of prostate cancer. Study results for some cancers are mixed, but one of the major limitations of some of these studies is that so many of them involve middle-aged subjects, while the risk of cancer actually begins to increase in childhood and early adulthood based on early diet and lifestyle habits. So the foundation is laid down for an increased risk of cancer even in children, and that's why we should be very mindful of what we feed our kids. In spite of these concerning facts, our government here in the United States recommends 3 8-ounce servings of dairy per day for adults and children age 9 and older. And this is a very common recommendation, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. Milk drinking is just something all children and adults should do. On a side note, it seems that adults are not following the guidelines with average consumption of only 1.6 servings a day, but probably the 1.6 servings per day is more than what anybody should consume. Willett and Ludwig, the two researchers, report that normal growth and development after weaning can be accomplished without consuming any dairy products at all. Dairy's most important function is being promoted as a source of calcium that's needed for building strong bones and reducing the risk of fractures, but research doesn't support this. In fact, research shows that countries with the highest intake of both milk and calcium have the highest incidence of hip fractures. Now, the authors acknowledge this is a correlation and there could be confounding factors, but the data are clear that lower dairy intake is associated with a lower risk of hip fracture, while higher dairy intake is associated with a higher incidence of fracture. And it's hard to ignore this in several dozen countries in which this appears to be the case. Now, I found this really interesting, and I didn't know it until I read this article, but the basis for the amount of daily milk consumption needed to support bone health consisted of one study that assessed the balance of calcium intake and excretion in only 155 adults. And even this study, aside from the fact that there are very few subjects, they were only followed for 2 to 3 weeks. They were assumed to require 741 milligrams of calcium per day, and they were already consuming a great deal of calcium at the start of the study. So that's pretty weak evidence, while the results for other better studies show the exact opposite. The influence of calcium in dairy on bone health is most likely significantly overstated. And I'll just give you some examples that I think stood out that were cited in the article. A study of Peruvian men showed that calcium balance was achieved with only 200 milligrams of calcium per day. It's really easy to get that amount of calcium from plant foods like leafy greens and orange. An orange has 125 milligrams of calcium. A meta-analysis of prospective studies with calcium intake ranging from less than 555 milligrams a day to over 1,100 milligrams showed that more calcium didn't reduce the risk of hip fracture, so taking more isn't better. Meta-analyses, including studies with milk intake ranging from 1.5 servings per week to 30, showed that total dairy intake was not related to the risk of hip fracture for men or women, and consuming more didn't really make any difference. Calcium recommendations for children vary a lot around the world, and in the United States, the recommendation is set at 1,000 milligrams a day for kids age 4 to 8, while in the UK, the recommendations are only 450 to 550 milligrams per day. Research shows that UK recommendations are probably the correct ones. Girls in early puberty have been shown to be in calcium balance with intakes of even less than 400 milligrams a day. And studies of kids between the age of 4 and 8 show that calcium intake really didn't have any relationship with bone mineral density at all. In a randomized trial, adolescents who were consuming less than 800 milligrams per day of calcium were given 3 additional servings of dairy every day for 18 months, and it just didn't have any effect on increasing bone mineralization. One problem with drinking milk is that it does promote growth, as I mentioned earlier, which increases height, and increased height is a risk factor for fractures. This is likely one of the reasons why studies do not show that high milk intakes during adolescence will decrease the risk of fracture, and in fact that the opposite appears to be true in studies where high intakes of dairy and calcium increase the risk of fracture. All in all, these are just a few of the studies, and they're much better done than the one study with 155 people. So there's a lot more research showing that calcium absorption increases when calcium intake is lower, and that calcium needs have been incredibly overstated. There's some, this wasn't in the article, but I'll say this here. There's some evidence to indicate that a lot of this hype about how much calcium we need is fueled by the dairy industry, because if you establish really high calcium levels, you can make it almost impossible for people to achieve them without drinking milk and or taking ridiculous amounts of calcium in supplements, which is the subject of the next section of the article. Results of studies looking at taking calcium supplements are just about as dismal as results from drinking milk to get calcium and build strong bones. A meta-analysis of 5 studies with over 6,700 subjects showed that calcium supplements did not reduce the risk of non-vertebral fractures, and the risk of hip fractures was higher in the calcium supplement group than in the placebo group. It is true that studies have shown that taking calcium supplements of somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 milligrams a day can lead to a 1 to 3% increased bone mineral density in the short term, but in the long term, the effect of calcium supplementation on bone mineral density is the same as placebo. Now, this is really important because so many of the trials are short term. Anything less than a year can be incredibly misleading, and the one that I mentioned earlier with 155 subjects that only lasted for 2 or 3 weeks, that's virtually irrelevant. And it's amazing how many studies I've found showing that calcium is beneficial that have looked at very short periods of time rather than long periods of time. And there are some risks associated with taking calcium supplements, which the authors of this review did not talk about, but I've covered in other videos that are posted on this channel. The authors cite cross-sectional studies that collectively include over 10,000 Americans as being more relevant, and these showed that calcium intake was not related to hip bone mineral density. Calcium supplements, when taken by children, lead to either no increase or a very small increase in bone density, which doesn't persist after discontinuation. And so there's this theory that is not very well supported, in my opinion, and in the author's opinion, that what children should do is calcium load through really, aggressive milk drinking during childhood, and then you create some type of calcium bank or strong bones that holds you through adulthood and reduces your risk of fractures later. But as soon as the excessive milk drinking and calcium supplementation stops, the benefit just goes away. So much for that theory. There are a lot of other concerns with dairy besides the fact that dairy doesn't build strong bones and there's a definite increased risk of cancer. The USDA says that in response to the fact that dairy products are pretty full of fat and densely caloric, well, all you have to do is just consume reduced fat dairy and then you won't have problems with weight gain. But research doesn't show that children who consume lower fat dairy products have healthier weights. So the strategy of consuming lower fat dairy products doesn't seem to make a whole lot of difference, and it may be because of the growth promoters and hormones that are in cow's milk that are just not really so good when consumed by humans. Milk is a high potassium food, and this leads some people, including health professionals, to suggest that consuming it can reduce blood pressure. Studies have looked at this and there are mixed results. And the authors have an interesting take on this. They say that the difference in whether or not milk reduces blood pressure depends upon the comparison foods. So if milk replaces sugary beverages and refined foods, it appears to be better. But they're worse when milk replaces nuts, legumes, and whole foods. And this is one of the common tricks in the food business is compare the food that you're trying to promote with bad foods, and sometimes your bad food comes out better than the other bad foods, instead of comparing the food that you're trying to promote with ideal foods that people are consuming, like fruits, vegetables, and legumes. Allergy to milk is another issue, and the authors acknowledge that lactose intolerance is really prevalent worldwide. In fact, a good portion of the world's population can't tolerate cow's milk. In a double-blind placebo-controlled study including children with cow's milk intolerance, 44 out of 65 kids had a reduction in symptoms, including resolution of anal fissures when they consumed soy milk instead, while there was no reduction in symptoms for the kids who continued to consume cow's milk. Researchers reported in this article that cow's milk also could have an adverse effect on asthma symptoms as well. Now, a couple of questions that I really like that this article covered. I mean, I think they make a very good case for the milk doesn't really give you any benefit, and there are some detrimental effects of consuming it, which range from lactose intolerance and allergic symptoms all the way up to increased risk of cancer. So one question that's fair to ask, and people bring this up all the time, well, you know, the milk products today are different than they were years and years ago, and if people were consuming much better quality milk or other animal products, it would be different. So is organic milk or milk from grass-fed cows better? Well, there aren't any long-term studies that have looked at the effects of drinking milk from cows treated with like bovine growth hormone or which contain residues of antibiotics and pesticides with milk from cows that have never been exposed to these substances. Canada and the European Union banned the use of bovine growth hormone, not because it was bad for humans, but because it caused so many problems with cows. It increased mastitis and foot issues and decreased fertility, so it was a bad idea for the animals. The sex hormone content of milk is increased if cows are milked while pregnant, and this practice is very prevalent not only in standard, normal, everyday dairy farms, but also organic farms as well. So we don't know if there's any difference there. So the bottom line is that we can hypothesize all day about better milk being better for you, but there aren't any research studies showing that. So based on the other things that I pointed out about the detrimental effects of milk, I personally would not consume it based on what I think the risk factors are, and I think it's a rational decision for other people to decide not to consume it too. Everybody's concerned today about the effect of many choices that we make on planetary health, and dairy farms have a particularly devastating effect on things like greenhouse gas production, climate change, water use, pollution, and antibiotic resistance. It's estimated that the damage per unit of dairy protein is 5 to 10 times greater than from production of equal amounts of plant foods like soy, legumes, and most grains. Willett and Ludwig write, the researchers, quote, limiting dairy production could make a major contribution toward reaching international greenhouse gas targets. And boy, if we combine that with getting rid of these conventional factory farms, we'd be well on our way to solving our problem without some of the more onerous things that have been proposed to us. So the conclusions, if you wanted to sum up all this information according to the authors, all nutrients found in cow's milk are available in other foods, and many world populations obtain these nutrients from non-dairy sources. Dairy does not reduce the risk of fractures, which is the leading justification for consuming it. The reported health benefits of dairy are related to the foods or beverage that dairy is compared to. Dairy fares better in studies in which it's compared to red meat and sugary drinks, but not so well when the comparison foods are healthy plant foods. There is no clear benefit associated with consuming low-fat dairy instead of higher-fat dairy. Adding dairy, the authors say, could be beneficial for children in populations in which diet quality is low or the diet is calorically inadequate. But in populations like here in the United States, in which children are consuming a calorically adequate diet, high intake of milk can increase the risk of fractures in adulthood and increase the risk of cancer, in part due to the increased height that results from milk drinking. Willett and Ludwood conclude that the recommendation to consume 3 or more servings of dairy per day is not justified, and they also add that children should not be encouraged to consume sugar-sweetened dairy such as chocolate milk either, which is often recommended as an enticement for kids to drink milk. It's an interesting thing. I've participated in the dietary guidelines hearings on a couple of different occasions, and there's a lot of discussion from the dairy industry, principally, about the importance of milk drinking. But kids really wouldn't drink as much milk if they didn't have to, and I don't think that we should let them replace it with Mountain Dew and other bad stuff. But the point is that there's always been a lot of discussion about sugar in dairy, chocolate milk, flavored milks, whatever we have to do to get the kids to drink it, because we know how important it is. And these authors specifically recommend against that. All right, well, a great review. I've not seen one that was quite so well put together, covered so many topics, which is why I wanted to pass it on to you. Hopefully you find this helpful in making your own decisions about what you want to eat every day. For me, I've ditched the dairy. Recommend that you do too. All right, that's all for today and all for the week. As usual, pass this on to anybody who you think would enjoy watching it, and I'll be back to you next week with more news.